Mackenzie Johnston with Tri-State Livestock News, bringing you discussions concerning fair cattle markets. Today we have the opportunity to chat with Bryan Hanson of Fort Pierre Livestock. Bryan, can you tell me a little bit about your background and your involvement within the cattle industry?
Yeah, I guess it started with my grandfather, Leif Hanson. He purchased the sale barn in Fort Pierre in 1953. He'd actually built the sale barn in Phillip in 1947. He sold the barn in Phillip and bought the barn in Fort Pierre and moved to town here. The sale barn burned down in 1978. At that time, my father, Dennis Hanson, took over and rebuilt the barn that stands today. I guess I've been with my father for, since I was old enough to wander out back, I guess would be a good way to explain it. So,
what do you feel are the major issues standing in the way of fair cattle markets today?
Where we're down to just four major packers that control over 80% of our cattle kill. That's one of the main deals. That much concentration in any industry is not good for business. One of the tools that they have as a leverage point with the current system is they have the ability to market these imported cattle from up to 22 different countries and bring them in and market them as a product to the USA. So that's kind of adding insult to injury. You've got a cheaper product that's brought in from multiple other countries that gets repackaged here in the United States and gets sent out with a USA label on it. That to me is an extreme injustice as well to the U.S. producers, as well as duping the U.S. consumer. They go to the store and they see a package of burger or steak or whatever, and they see that product to the USA label. They have no reason to think otherwise. But what that does is that allows the packing industry to distort a supply and demand model. In a typical supply and demand model, if your supply gets short, your demand is good, that should cause your price of your goods to go up. What you've got with the current state of the industry is they've got basically an unlimited supply of cheaper product coming from up to 22 different countries, and they can use that to offset any shortages there is in the supply. So with that allows them to keep the cattle prices depressed here in the United States. And back in 2013 and 14 and early 15, we had a country of origin labeling system in place that allowed the U.S. consumer to choose to buy the U.S. product. And in that model, you saw that the contracts that the packers were filling for beef were actually getting tight, because they were moving all beef, but the imported beef was sold at a discounted price. The demand stayed good for the U.S. product, therefore they actually had to compete. Even though we had the concentration in the packing industry of only four major packers, it did force them to compete for our product. Once the COOL law was repealed, they've actually went even worse than it was prior to COOL, because now they've reverted back to some law from, I think, back in the 80s or something of that nature that allows them, if anything's repackaged here, it can be labeled as product to the USA. Now they're using our label on everything.
There was a resolution brought forward by a couple senators in the past few weeks to basically they were backing MCOOL. Do you think we're going to see some laws passed in the near future to reinstate mandatory country of origin labeling?
Well, I hope so. We've been talking to different senators about introducing actual legislation rather than a resolution. The biggest hurdle that you face when you go to D.C. with a country of origin labeling law is that they bring up the WTO's ruling, which I believe was like $1.2 billion in retaliatory trade tariffs.
Right.
And that's the first thing that gets thrown in your face. Well, the ruling by the WTO was very specific. It stated that while they had to take the burden of segregation and the labeling and keeping their beef separate, the Canadian and Mexican cattle, there was only about 40% of it that was actually labeled when it went across the counter. And it was pretty specific ruling by the WTO. So what we've been talking to senators about is to introduce a mandatory COOL law on all beef, which would be better for the industry anyway, and it would alleviate the concerns from the WTO about any retaliatory tariffs. So I guess that's the direction that we're working. We hope to get some senators on board with this. And I think there's a huge push in the industry right now for country of origin labeling. It's just a matter of figuring out a way to get it passed without causing harm to other industries, because the retaliatory tariffs that would get administered by the WTO, it wouldn't necessarily be even against beef. They have a system devised to where it does damage to all segments of agriculture. And in this case, it could be the grape and wine industry, or it could be the cotton industry, or it could be corn or soybeans or whatever different segments of ag that they would choose to put the retaliatory tariffs on. So without alleviating that first, it's a pretty tough conversation to have. We think we've got a way to do that by putting a blanket on all beef and having all beef labeled back both across the counter as well as going to the restaurant chain. And by doing that, it would not only help us U.S. producers and give the U.S. consumer the right to choose American product and support the American producer, and at the same time, it would nullify the WTO's ruling. So we got our fingers crossed. We hope we have a way to go about it.
There has been a few proposals brought forward, as most recent 5014 negotiated cash trade. That proposal has been brought forward to increase negotiated cash trade. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you've got the 50% cash negotiated cattle is a good start. There's been studies that show that anytime an industry has ability to procure over 50% of its product by captive supply, it gives them the leverage to negatively affect the market. And you can see that today, not only in downward cattle prices, but also in the fact that these contract cattle, these captive supply cattle, are the ones that are getting the space on the kill floor. But right now, if you took this epidemic, if they still had to buy 50% of their cattle on the open cash market, they wouldn't be killing, these packers wouldn't be killing a bunch of their own cattle and their own captive supply cattle. They would still have to participate in the open market, which would do two things. One, it would allow the independent feeder that's not under contract to still market their fat cattle, but it also would show a transparent market. It's kind of like this. You've got sale barns all across the country that have auctions on a daily basis. That's what you call price discovery. Whether you like the market or not, the market can be up or the market can be down, but having the open market, price discovery, that's fair to both sides, and you actually establish a true market. Any of you folks that feed fat cattle, the way it is now, is kind of a joke. You might get a call on a Friday morning, and you got 5 minutes to decide whether you want to sell 600 head of fat cattle, or in today's case, you might have 600 on the show list and have the opportunity to sell 2 loads. It's just a broken system right now. So the 50% is a good start. I've had a lot of producers and cattle feeders that have told me it should be 100%. They shouldn't be able to forward contract and have any captive supply cattle, which I guess I tend to agree with. I think it should all be on an open market, but the 50% is darn sure a good start.
Do you know very many feeders that need to have cattle slaughtered but currently can't get them moved?
Oh, definitely. There's a lot of my customers that are sitting on fat cattle. In fact, some of them haven't had a bid in 7 weeks.
The past 3-4 weeks, the market has been up, but at the same time, we are still increasing this backlog of cattle. We're not really moving through these large amounts of cattle. When do you feel like this backlog of cattle is going to catch up with the market and negatively affect it?
Well, it's kind of like this. It's already negatively affecting it. And you talk about the market being up, but with the price of box beef, the cattle market is not even in the realm of what the box beef is. Now, in a typical system, go back a few years, if the box beef was at 210 or 220, or pick your number, and you were going to sell your fat cattle hanging, you could usually get within $5 to $10 of the box selling your fat cattle. Or there was times when the market got pretty good and the offal got high that you could even get over box beef, because the packers were also getting the head and the hooves and the hide and the offal, which would figure up to $125 to $150 a head that they would make on that. So even if they were losing a little bit on the beef, they were still making it up on the offal and the hides, which allowed them to operate at a profit, and it also gave you a fairly realistic market. Anymore, ever since the repeal of country of origin labeling, you've seen a huge spread. They used to move kind of in unison, the box beef price versus the cattle price. They've kind of moved up and down in similar fashion. Since that, they still move in unison. It's just that there's a huge gap between them. And as was the case back during the Holcomb fire, you saw the Packers' profits soared up over even up to $800 a head on fat cattle for a period of time, to which we thought was extremely unfair because at that time the Packers were making money and the cattle feeders were losing quite a lot of money. So it seemed like an extremely distorted system. And now, with the COVID-19 epidemic, they've made the Holcomb fire look like child's play. Packer profits, they're towards, I think the high was in the 460 range on choice box. At that time, when I guess I just did the math on a 1,500-pound steer, it was pushing up towards $3,000 a head, gross profit. And I believe in today's market, with the box beef coming back down some and the fat cattle market coming up some, they're still realizing, over $2,000 a head profit. So there's a huge disconnect. The consumer is getting run over the coals at the cash register because the price of beef is through the roof. And at the same time, they're using our broken system to steal these cattle from these producers. They should not be losing money on these fat cattle at the same time that the packer is making 4 times their record profit. Frankly, I think it's price fixing. I think it's collusion, and I think it's price gouging to the consumer, and I think it's all against the law. And if it was those kids that you saw marking up the hand sanitizer on Amazon, they threw them in jail, confiscated their product, and made a big news story out of it. And I think they ought to do the same thing to the packing industry, because what they're doing is not only immoral, but as far as I'm concerned, it's illegal.
You just mentioned the Holcomb plant fire. There was supposed to be an investigation into that fire, into meat packer pricing and everything that went along with that situation. Do you feel like we are ever going to get answers from that investigation?
Well, you got to realize that investigation was done by the USDA. You got Sonny Perdue and his crew in there investigating the packing industry, and I guess that's what I'd call letting the fox watch over the hen house, because I think that Sonny Perdue is pretty well aligned with the packing industry and likes the vertical integration that's taking place with it. So I would be extremely surprised if they find anything with the USDA investigation. Now, since the pandemic with COVID-19, they've involved the Department of Justice. I don't know if William Barr is going to find anything or not, but if he can, he's not looking very hard, because it's pretty evident what's going on. If you just look at the beef prices versus the cattle prices and compare that to what the consumer is paying and these packer profits, there's obviously wrongdoing going on.
You are the president of South Dakota Livestock Auction Markets Association, and your organization recently has made a push for sale barns to work on checkoff referendum. Can you elaborate a little bit on that push that your organization is doing?
Yes, we here a couple weeks ago, or I guess probably 3 or 4 weeks ago now, we had a meeting of the South Dakota Auction Market Association, and we voted to move forward with policy to bring a petition to bring a referendum up or down vote to the checkoff. What that stems from is your checkoff dollar is supposed to be used to promote beef. It's supposed to be used to help promote your product. But frankly, demand for beef is high. There's 2 big problems. The producer who's paying the checkoff isn't seeing it, and they won't promote USA beef. Beef is beef is kind of their slogan, and whether it comes from Mazatlan or Manitoba or Montana or Texas, it's all the same. They won't promote USA beef, and so those are a couple of the issues that we've got. And then the big issue is that your checkoff dollar is handled by the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, which you have to realize they use the name the Cattlemen's, but what it really is a lobby organization for the packing industry. That's when they merged back in the 90s. It was the National Cattlemen's Association. They merged with the Beef Association. They now have beef processors that sit on their board. So what's good for the packer is profits, which they're realizing a bunch of. What's good for the cattleman is profits. Well, for one to have a bigger profit than the other, one's got to give to let the other one take. Well, the way I see it, the packing industry's doing all the taking, and your checkoff dollar that's supposed to help the producer is helping the packer and leaving the producer set by the wayside, and we're the ones paying it. So I guess all that we're asking is, if we're going to be the ones paying it, to put some checks and balances into that system, into that dollar checkoff. We think that the people paying it should have the right to vote on it, whether they want to keep it or not. They had a vote on it when they implemented it, and everybody, or not everybody, but a large percentage voted to enact it and put it in play. Well, I don't think that they should allow that to go on inevitably without any input from the people paying it. And I think that an up or down vote on whether to continue with the program is something that should be done on a 5-year basis, frankly. I think it needs to happen now, and I think it's something that should happen with all those checkoffs. They should have a check and balance put into their program with the producers paying it, having the ability to vote up or down on a 5-year basis. So that's what we're working for. We're getting together with several other organizations as well as businesses and individuals. We're going to try to get a petition drive going to bring this beef checkoff to a referendum vote.
If for some reason we don't see some significant change within our cattle markets, within our cattle industry, and we continue down this rough path with these unfair cattle markets, what do you see happening to the American cattle producer?
Well, I think that they've already got a pretty good game plan. You saw it happen to the poultry industry, and you saw it happen to the hog industry. It becomes vertically integrated. People say, well, how would they do that? I said, well, look at how they handled the hog industry. They took the hogs down to about 16 cents, and they broke probably half of the hog producers, but they didn't get them all. So if you remember back in the 90s, pretty soon the hogs went clear to 8 cents, and that broke them all. It broke all hog producers, and at that point in time, the only way to continue to operate on your farm was to raise hogs for the packing industry. They vertically integrated it from birth to plate, and they had control of it from start to finish. And I guess the way I see it is if we don't get some things turned around, you're going to see the same kind of thing happen here. People are willing to work on their place for little to nothing just in order to stay on their own farm and ranch. And the way to do that is to get them broke. And it looks to me like the packing industry and the beef sector is trying to copy what took place in the hog industry 20-some years ago. So I don't think that most of these cattle ranchers and cattle feeders care to be a servant on their own land to work for pennies on the dollar at the end of the day. To be independent, that's what running cattle is all about. You run your own cattle, the better job you do, the more money you should get paid for your product. But right now that's a broken system, and we're definitely not getting paid for our product when they can import it from all these other countries that operate with way less input costs. Their land taxes, their labor costs, everything is considerably less than it is here in the U.S. But yet right now we're expected to compete for selling our product for the same dollars as what they can produce it in these other foreign countries. A lot of them are third world type countries. They've got extremely low wages. I don't know about the rest of you folks, but I don't care to work for $2 a day.
Right.
But that's some of the labor costs that you're competing against when you're getting imported beefs coming in and going across the counter, the same as yours, with it all having a product to the USA label on it.
Do you have an outlook for calves coming this fall?
Well, there's a lot of segments to this thing that can change between now and next fall, and my crystal ball doesn't get out of the shop until the second Tuesday of next week. So there is a tremendous amount of light being shed on the cattle industry right now, and maybe that'll be the silver lining in this whole COVID-19 pandemic, is that we finally get some attention brought to our industry and finally get some of these people that have the ability to make a difference step up and do so, and to restructure the way the packing industry works, to re-implement mandatory country of origin labeling, to give us U.S. producers a chance to showcase our product, and also to give the U.S. consumer the ability to support the U.S. producer. Those are two major things, and also either reform or repeal of your checkoff dollar will also be something that makes a difference to me, because the National Cattlemen's Beef Association has control of that checkoff dollar, and that's the very organization that's standing in the doorway on those two issues. For example, they were instrumental in helping to get rid of country of origin labeling. They're darn sure standing in the doorway right now as far as trying to get it re-implemented. They've also, right off the bat, come out very harshly against the 50-14 cash rule. Anything that could better the U.S. producer, it seems to me that the NCBA wants to stand in the door and make sure it doesn't happen. I think we need to take the dollar away from them as well. And if the packing industry wants to pay the dollar, I guess let them collect it from them to run their organization. That's the way I look at it.
We've been experiencing tough cattle markets for a few years now, and then obviously it fell out of bed here about 2 months ago. Do you see these tough cattle markets having an impact on the rural community that you're living in?
Well, I've always said that they do these stimulus packages, started back in '08 or '09 there with the recession or whatever, and now we've had these stimulus programs come out due to the COVID-19. And I've always said that the best stimulus package is to give the agriculture producer a fair market, because whether you're a corn farmer, whether you're a fat cattle feeder, or whether you're a cow-calf operator, if you're in agriculture and you're making good money, you're going to spend it. And Main Street flourishes, the implement dealers flourish, the car dealers. I tell you what, when we see good times in ag, you've got construction going on, they're building new buildings, they're doing improvements to their farm or their ranch. That money gets circulated back through these communities tenfold. And the other thing is the young people. Young people don't have any reason to stay on the farm or the ranch right now with these prices in ag. They can get a job in town for more money and less work than what it is out in the country. So what incentives do we have to give these young folks to stay on the land? There's not much right now. But when prices are good, all of a sudden you see the young folks have an interest. They want to come back. They want to farm. They want to ranch, the same as dad or granddad or great-granddad. But we've got to have money in our pockets in order to keep these young folks on the land.
Before I let you go, do you have any closing comments you'd like to make?
If you're a senator in your state is not signed on with this 50-14 rule, I would encourage you to call your senators, explain to them the reasons why you would like to see the fat cattle being purchased by these processors on a cash basis to put more transparency into your fat cattle markets. And also, don't forget to mention to them how important it is to bring back mandatory country of origin labeling of beef to give us U.S. producers the right to try to survive here with the way these agriculture prices are.